Hi, I'm Johnny Lewis, and I want to thank you for watching my presentation related to Module 1 for Class 850. First, a little bit about me. I am a spouse to my wife, Monica. I'm the father of two kids, an 18-month-old and a 9-year-old. We live in Shawnee, Kansas. I work for the DeSoto School District. I'm a center-based teacher for secondary students with emotional and behavioral needs. My hobbies and interests, I'm a huge fan of the Tennessee Volunteers, which is kind of sad these days. I'm a big Chiefs fan, which is lots of fun. I am really into fish and jam bands. During the pandemic, I picked up reading Neil deGrasse Tyson and other science books, which I understand about a tenth of, but I'm fascinated by. My professional experiences, I've spent 7 years in secondary special education, collaborative teaching, center-based behavior programs, para-educator staff management, and then prior to that, I spent 9 years in nonprofit management, fundraising, budgeting, and staffing. For my education, I have a master's in special education. I have a master's of divinity with an area of study in clinical counseling, which comes in handy working with behavioral students. I have a doctorate in theology, and my dissertation area of study was nonprofit management, sustainability, and community partnerships for nonprofits in the 21st century United States. So that seems, even though public schools are not nonprofits, there's a lot of pieces of that conversation that relate to leadership of local public schools. Module 1, we had a conversation, or we read literature about 3 levels of government control of public education. The first level of support is local support. The majority of decision making for local schools happens within local districts that are divided geographically by cities and counties. Districts receive the majority of their funding from property taxes in the communities that they serve. This creates a conversation around access for local schools. If the vast majority if more than 50% of the funding of local schools comes from property taxes in the community, and property taxes are often based on the wealth and property value of the people living in that community, then there's a conversation to be had about how that kind of structure affects students who live in communities where property values are lower, and their access to quality education and to some of the benefits that students who live in more wealthy school districts receive. States support an average of 42% of the budget for education in public schools. This varies significantly by state. States initiate and hold schools accountable to core standards that are to be taught in subject areas, and then they use testing as a means of assessing school progress. Federal financial support amounts to only about 8% of education spending. The Federal Department of Education has the mission of equal access to education and encouraging excellence in public schools. They promote the laws for equal access to students, employees, and encourage awareness of research and information related to academic excellence. Again, this kind of comes back to one of the issues that you read when reading about the role of the federal government in public education. We come back to the point that the federal government is the most responsible for equal access, but only supports education through 8% of education spending. And so if equal access is only being supported through 8%, or necessarily being supported through 8% of education spending, there's an opportunity for access to be more difficult to some students. Local leadership is the way that most local governments are set up. 96% of local school boards are set up. They have elected school boards who choose then a superintendent who is hired to act as a full-time leader of the district staff. In the state of Kansas, we have a commissioner for education, and then we have a state board of education. Recently in our state, this has been a hot topic of conversation as the governor made a decision about COVID and schools being in remote learning, and then the state board of education overturned that decision and made it a local decision. And so we got to see kind of these 3 levels of government played out here in our state. Federally, the federal leadership for education primarily is the Secretary of Education, who's a member of the President's Cabinet. They serve as the voice and advocate for the policies of the administration as it relates to congressional budgeting and to laws that are related to access and educational excellence. As it relates to which body is responsible for each part of the components for number 6, the responsibility of local leadership tends to focus most on 6.1, which is implementing management and evaluating and communicating school-level governments, operation systems that support student learning. They develop the local mission and vision. They manage the staff and govern the school at the local level. One of the places where I found this information was my own district's website, the DeSoto School District, looking at the vision and the mission, the way it is described there, and the way those responsibilities are laid out. And then component 6.2, evaluate, develop, and advocate for a data-informed and equitable resourcing plan that supports school improvement and student development. States collect data. In particular, they collect testing data, and then they resource based on that testing data. And so 6.2 seems to be primarily the responsibility of states. And then component 6.3, reflectively evaluate, communicate about, and implement laws, rights, policies, and regulations to promote student and adult success and well-being. This component tends to be primarily about access and the right that every person has to access to a quality public education. And so the federal level tends to take responsibility for component 6.3. Standard correlation, this lesson supports standard 6 by reviewing descriptions and key issues related to agencies responsible for implementing standard 6. It's relevant and added to my learning by increasing my understanding of school board funding sources, legal responsibilities, and the chain of command related to school mission and vision. And then this assignment will influence my decisions as a future building leader by ensuring that I understand the legal responsibilities and the chain of organization related to local, state, and federal education agencies. These are the references and sources which I use to complete this module. Thank you again for viewing my presentation.